Good morning. Let's see. Got to get everything ready. All right. Can you all hear me? Am
Yes.
I? Okay. So let's see. I believe that we have a couple of people. Drupchen and Donnie will not be joining us today. They are among the, what do we say, latest victims of the epidemic. Maybe they're not victims yet, but they're at least the latest, among the latest people to catch it. So we will begin, as we did last week, by going for refuge and arousing bodhicitta. So please join me in reciting, and we'll do it in Tibetan because I don't know it in Tibetan, Spanish, or Portuguese. And you probably don't know my translation in English, so we'll do it in Tibetan. O sanje chedan soge chonam la chancho bardo dane japsum je dage jinso gi bedi dage rola penjur sanje robar sho sanje chedang soge chonam la chancho bardo dane japsum je dage jinso gi bade dagi drola penjur sanje drobar sho sangye chedang soge chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum chi dagi jinso gibe sanam di dola penjur sanje drobar sho semjen tamje dewa tang dewe judan dembar jurchi donga da donga ji judan rawar jurchi donga melbe dewa tamba tam min rawar jurchi Yerin chadani tang rawe tanyon shambola ne barjorji. The Dharma expands palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas of the three times, who shows me directly in my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. Now, please think to yourselves that we are gathering today, gathering online, in order to bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space to the state of lasting happiness, lasting true happiness, which is the state of Buddhahood. And in order to do that, in addition to listening, contemplating, and meditating, we also need to do what we can to benefit other sentient beings. And one way of doing this is translation. And in order to translate, we need to first think about how we translate, what's important. Well, you can start translating before then, like I did. But if you think a little bit about that first at the beginning, it'll help you later as you go through the processes of learning to translate, learning how to bring the words and the meaning into your own language and make it possible for other people to understand. And so, for this reason, please remember that the ultimate thing that we need to do with translation is to bring other sentient. It's a tool to bring other people, other sentient beings to Buddhahood. So please listen with the motivation of bodhicitta. And let's see, last week we spoke a lot about the motivation, but that is, of course, the most important thing. Because everything is going to follow it. It really makes everything come into line later on. And so I'll continue talking about that. At the end of the talk last week, we did speak a little bit about learning Tibetan. And this is actually, learning Tibetan is just one aspect of the training that you have to go through in order to become a translator. And so those of you who are in the Dhammasagar program, you're getting some of the other aspects of that training. We're working with Khenpos, you're getting teachings and so forth, but there's a lot to work on. So in terms of, so when you look at it, there's, of course, you have to learn the source language, which is Tibetan, generally. There are some exceptions. There are some issues about that. So it's important for us to learn Tibetan as well as we can. And as I said last week, we need to try to make sure that our knowledge of Tibetan is not merely an intellectual knowledge, but that we are able to gain some sort of a feeling. And this takes time. I mean, anytime you're learning a new language, it takes time to get to the point where you're actually able to like feel like it's more than just like torture, especially when you're doing learning a language that is as different from our, most of us are translating into European languages. So if you're translating into European language, and Tibetan is like totally different. I mean, the word order is backwards. The things that are important in English and other languages, well, especially in English. Like in English, you must have a subject in a sentence, even if you don't really need a subject. Like when we say, it is raining, there's really no reason in English to have to say it. Because if there's no subject in English, we're like, whoa, what's going on? Now, I mean, I'm not sure how it is in Spanish and Portuguese, but, in the Romance languages, you inflect the verbs. So like I know, I learned a little bit of Italian when I went to Italy when I was 9 years old. I was like, no parlo italiano, right? I don't need to say io no parlo italiano. I don't need to say io. I just say no parlo, right? Because the verb ending tells you. So that is a difference between English and the Romance languages. So you have to take what I'm saying as a grain of salt and see, how is it actually in your language? What is actually important in a sentence? But in English, at least, if you don't have a subject in the sentence, there's no sentence. In Tibetan, you don't even really need a subject. You don't need a subject at all, because half the time you know what the subject is, or you should know, or you're expected to know, or you listen to some other clue. Sometimes it's like the level of shesa in the verb, which tells you who is being talked about and talking to whom. What is the relationship between the subject and the recipient of the action, the object, indirect object, whatever you call it. And that determines the level of shesa. So you've got a bunch of words that can be used for like giving. You've got terwa, akazo, tongwa, and jimba, and jimba tangwa. Actually, in Kake, we wouldn't say jimba, we'd say jimba tayada, and salwa, and all these different verbs. And we're also pulwa. So when you say salwa, like, oh, the person who's giving it is like not just respectable, but really, salwa. It's like you say that for like the Buddha or for like a High Lama. And you say, so when you say salwa, then the other person is, just a regular person, right? So that's showing you. So then who the two people, and you should know who the two people involved are, and that tells you who the subject is and who the object is, right? So for us, we have to think through it until you get to a point where you can really kind of feel it. So that just takes time, and it takes a bit of dedication and working with it. You just have to keep going. You start out with the little things, you learn a little bit of shesa, a little bit of this, you just learn how the language works, and then gradually it'll come. Now, as I said last week, finding a way to actually work in Tibetan, which of course means that you're going to be at like probably at an intermediate level of Tibetan. All right. So when you're at an intermediate level of Tibetan, and if your circumstances permit, then what's really helpful is to go to like where your teacher is and try to work with their monastery or nunnery or whatever organization they have, where there are lots of Tibetans, preferably ones who don't speak English. I mean, I don't think you have to worry about Tibetans speaking Portuguese or Spanish so much, but they all want to speak English. I mean, you might have more who want to speak Spanish. And there probably are several Tibetans who do speak Spanish, but it's not like English, because every English has this sort of like sort of ing in Tibetan. We'd say everyone wants to speak English. The basically the lingua franca for our own day. So in any case, what this means, what you need to do is you need to go someplace where you're going to be, or if you can try to arrange a way to actually work with people in Tibetan. So you just have to use Tibetan in you just have to use it to do things, and you don't have time to think, what is this, what is that? And then you say lots of stupid things and people laugh at you. And when people laugh at you, you should be happy. You should not be. If you are embarrassed when you are learning a language, there's no point, because you're learning the language, you are going to say stupid things. There's just no way to avoid it. So you have to be willing to learn, say stupid things and learn it, just to learn the Tibetan, to work with it. That's one aspect. And as you get better with with speaking and using it, even though there's a bigger difference between the written language and the spoken language in Tibetan than there are in most of our Western languages. So the difference is bigger, but the basic structures are similar. So instead of looking at, the kind of surface things like what helping verbs, what endings do you use, like, in the in the language, and especially in the sutras and the old translations, where you have the dzogtsik at the end of this of the sentence is a dzogso, like saying that's the end of a sentence. Well, you'd never say that in ordinary language. People would laugh at you. We had a student who came to Varanasi, and he'd studied some classical, they call it classical Tibetan. And he came with his wife. Now, he was a longtime student, so everyone knew him. So he came in and he said to the librarian, "Duni daki dot me ma wo." It's just like saying, "This is my wife, Doc Mema." But in like very old language, like if you said it in old English or old Spanish, that's kind of the flavor. So the librarian still laughs about this, 20 years later. But when you look at it, in regular language, the word order is the same, right? Some of the words are the same. Of course, instead of saying gimin, the other person used damema because he knew the life of Marpa, the translator. You'd say. So the structure is the same, even if the grammar is a little bit different. So using that helps you. And the reason why this is important is that the biggest difficulty for us in learning to speak Tibetan is learning how to reorder our thoughts so that we are then able to bring it out, right, in a way that sounds like Tibetan. When we are able to do that in what we speak, then we will understand better when it is happening and it's coming back at us. So you might be involved in like an oral interpretation, or you're involved in a written translation. An oral interpretation, of course, you have to understand the way the Lama you're franchising for speaks, right? It's just basic. Now, they'll probably throw you into it before you really understand everything, which is a great way to learn. Maybe not so good for the students listening to you, but it's a great way to learn. And it's an important experience to have. But I think most of the translators I know learned more or less by fire, or the oral interpreters, we learned by fire. Said the Lama said, "You're going to translate." It's like, oh, really? I'll do my best. But it's also really important then when you're looking at written translation, because especially when you get written translation, you've got these long, complicated sentences, and if you don't have a feel for how the word order works, how things are put together, then you're going to have a lot of trouble parsing them and figuring out what actually is being said. So when you have that feeling for that kind of a little bit, maybe not organic yet, but at least kind of a little bit of a feeling, as you get that, then you're going to see that when you read texts, you will actually have more understanding of those texts. So this is why it is important to actually learn how to speak a little bit. Now, you don't necessarily have to be completely fluent. I don't necessarily think, but you have to have a point where you have a little bit of feeling. And that gives you a little bit of then when you read, you can get that feeling back. Otherwise, when you read, you're going to be working so hard to try to put the meaning together for yourself in whatever language you're thinking. You're working so hard to put that meaning together that you aren't going to be able to get any feeling out of the words. And if you aren't getting feeling out of the words, then you aren't going to be able to communicate that feeling. It's like I spoke the other day. What's really going to bring the power of the words or the blessing of the words is the feeling. Actually, when we think about the Tibetan word jinlap, we always translate it in English as blessing, and you probably use some sort of cognitive blessing or similar word in Spanish or Portuguese, right? Primarily. What it really means, it's like the power to transform your mind. Jinpa is like the power to change your mind. Lapa is to like change. So it means something's going to change you. It's what we in English, in normal English, you would say it's something that's moving. Something that is really, really moving or exciting. If you go to a movie that really makes you feel something, then that's jinlap. It's not Dharma jinlap, but it's jinlap, So it's something that's giving you a feeling and give you an experience, something that's changing your mind, changing the way you think. And it can even be on a kind of subtle level. Now I'm getting a little bit off of the translation, but even on a subtle level, like Trungpa Rinpoche often talks about how there are people who went to India and they were like hippie backpackers and or whatever, just backpackers or people traveling. And there's this Kala Chakra with a Dalai Lama. Well, he's famous. I'm going to go. And they go. And after that, something changes. It's not like there's any big thing happening, but something changes in their mind. And then they engage in Dharma practice. Well, what is it? That is blessings. That's what we mean by blessings. So it doesn't mean that you're going to shake or levitate or, cry out of, receiving blessings or have some sort of mystical experience. But that's what we mean by blessings. So when we're talking about bringing the feeling of the text into our own languages, that means that we're trying to be able to bring the blessings to the people who are receiving it, which means that we need to kind of understand it and get some feeling for ourselves. And then when we can have that feeling for ourselves, then we'll be able to communicate it better to others. So this is the learning of the Tibetan, focusing on the importance of learning to speak. And the other aspect that you need to do in Tibetan is actually you have to have a excuse me for a moment. You need to have a good knowledge of Tibetan literature. You need to basically you need to read a lot in Tibetan. Because when you look at the things that we are asked to translate, there are things that were translated into Tibetan in the 8th century or 9th century, things that are translated in the 13th, sometime between the 10th and the 14th century, things that were written in Tibetan, some from the ancient period, more from, the middle period, and a lot from more recent centuries. And occasionally you'll even be asked to translate things that were spoken now. Like you'll have a teacher would have given a teaching that was transcribed in Tibetan. They say, please translate this into Portuguese. Please translate this into Spanish. Right. So there's a whole wide variety. And when you look at the material that, is written translated in the 8th century and the material that's written now, they're very different. I mean, this is natural. If you look at what's happened I mean, I'm totally ignorant of Spanish and Portuguese, so you'll have to excuse me for that. But if you look at the literature of Spanish and Portuguese, from when did it start? Probably, I mean, it came out of Roman literature, I'm sure, but probably developed in the middle of the first millennium, and then probably something recognizably Spanish or Portuguese at the beginning of around the turn of the first millennium. And then getting a little bit more so, definitely by the 15th century, you had real Spanish and Portuguese literature, right? And then you have, all the development of the classical periods, the modern periods, and all. So what is it that happened? You look at it, you see that your own literature and your own language has changed. And then you have modern literature, which is, again, very different. Similarly with Tibetan. So one thing that is really helpful to do in reading Tibetan or in learning Tibetan is to read as much as you can in as many different genres as you can. Just read. You should just, pick something for your bedtime reading. And you're just going to read it. One of the things that I did that actually helped my Tibetan a lot is when I first took monastic vows, I knew I needed to study the Vinaya, but I was traveling with Rinpoche and didn't have an opportunity to get actual classes on it. And I tried to pick up all the different commentaries on the Vinaya, and I couldn't make heads or tails of them. So I actually just sat down and started reading the Vinaya in the Kanji order. And there are 13 volumes I read over the course of 2 years, 3 years. I read 11 of them till I got the one that didn't have any stories and I couldn't get any more. They're asking all these hypothetical questions. It's like about a really odd situation. It's like all these strange hypothetical questions that then, of course, are recorded in the commentaries. It wasn't nearly as fun reading as the rest of the Vinaya, which is actually brilliant, brilliant reading. Anyways, so doing that was extremely helpful for my Tibetan. Then you need to read, maybe you don't need to read all, I mean, you're not monks and nuns, so you don't need to read the Vinaya, actually. But you can take a look at the sutras. Read the sutras, start with the shorter ones and see what you understand them. Generally, for us, as we're learning Tibetan, often it's easier for us to understand that language than it is to understand later language. So you can just try reading some of that, especially if you get involved in the 84th, if you're thinking about getting involved in the 84,000 project. And I don't know what they're doing. I don't pay attention to anything other than I really absolutely have to know. So I don't really know exactly what they're doing with Spanish and Portuguese. But if there is some similar project as in English to translate the Kanjura into Spanish and Portuguese, I think it'd be great. If you want to do that, you first need to actually read and be able to get feeling, which means you just got to read a lot. And eventually you'll get feeling. Okay. So there's that. Then historically, we've got all I'm going to leave the Tantra aside because that's an entirely different matter. But if you take a look in the 10th century, you've got more translations, of course, happening. You've also got a lot of the Kadampa instructions, some of which are really beautiful, but they're hard to read because they're all written. These weren't people writing in formal Tibetan. They were writing in colloquial dialects for a particular area. And you're looking through them and there are these words that you cannot find in any dictionary. You have no idea what they mean, but you need to try to read them again as much as you can. You also need to think about, basically you need to read all the different genres. So sometimes when we're studying, if you are studying in like a kind of formal study program, then your studies are going to focus on the great philosophical texts and the Dharma texts. And often you're going to get those from 19th and 20th century commentaries, early 20th century commentaries, especially in the Kaju school, where you get a lot by Jamgon Kongtrul Lodrö Tai. And his writing is beautiful, very clear, very good writing, but it is a particular style. Then if you go on a little bit further in your studies, you start getting into the works of 8th Karmapa Mikkyö Dorje, which can be difficult. The ninth Karmapa, the seventh Karmapa, and the other masters of that time. And of course, in all the other lineages, and I'm sure there's some of you in the Nyingma Sakya, whatever lineage you're from, that you're going to have the different classics in your own things. But often you're going to be, what you'll find as you look at them, there is kind of a particular way of writing in those works. And if you understand those works, of course, it helps you understand the Dharma, but it gives you a very limited basis for the Dharma. So when you are studying with a Khenpo, they're going to want to go through, and like in the Nyingma school, they're going to want to go back to the works of Mipam Rinpoche and maybe Khenpo Shenga, right? In the Kaiju school, we're going to go to Jamgon Kodo Lodo Tai and Mikyo Dorje. Well, this is all basically the same style. I mean, Mikyo Dorje is much more complicated, just as he's very complicated writing. But they're basically the same style. So if you only study that, then someone gives you, oh, please translate this text on mind training by, I don't know, Poto or whoever it is. Kara Gomchen's like, what is this? You won't be able to make heads or tails of it. Because it's a different, well, you'll be able to get a little bit into it, but won't really. So you got to read. You got to read in as many different genres and in many different styles to do this. Now, another thing that actually is coming out recently, there is the Gyatsae translation project, translating Western classics into Tibetan. So you can read some of those translations, especially if it's a work that you know. Like I reread the Elie Wiesel's Nacht, or the Night, right? I read it in Tibetan. And I thought, what's this? And I had to go back and look at the English, because this is in modern Tibetan. I have to admit, I don't read a whole lot in really contemporary Tibetan. I don't do a lot of translation of contemporary Tibetan. But reading that was really helpful. Then also you can kind of go back and laugh at the way they transcribe all these Eastern European place names into Tibetan letters and wonder, how are they going to pronounce these? This doesn't even look anything like it's supposed to sound. But anyways, but reading things like that, that's all very good. So reading as much as you can in different genres. And when you read them, it's also helpful to read them aloud. In English, we've lost the habit of reading aloud. Now, if you're doing bedtime reading and you've got your partners next to you and you're like, you can't necessarily read aloud, but you should spend some time reading things aloud and getting a feel for it, particularly when you're like reading verses. And I keep coming back to verse because I think that verse has a particular power. And so if you want to get a sense of the feeling of Tibetan verse, you need to be able to pronounce it. You need to be able to read it. So you read the verses, you read the prayers and so forth. You read the songs of Milarepa in Tibetan, read them aloud. You can learn some of the Tibetan melodies and sing them with the Tibetan melodies. Then you get kind of a feel for the language, in addition to reading some really beautiful things, right? So it's important to read as much as you can. So that's basically what we need to do with learning the Tibetan. I mean, that's like the overall. Well, I guess one other, I'll worry about that later. We're learning the Tibetan. Then the other issue is when you're translating from Tibetan into your own language, then you have to know your own language well. Now, I'm assuming that this is actually a wrong assumption. I know some very good English translators who basically wasted their entire schooling, probably under the influence of alcohol or some controlled substances, who've turned out to be actually very good translators. People who didn't really, didn't go through the university high education route, who turned out to be good translators. And that's what we want. So it really doesn't matter where you came from before, but what you need is you need to have some familiarity of the literature in your own language. So you need to know what is beautiful in your own language. And just as it's important to read different genres in Tibetan, it's important to know the different genres in your own language. So you need to go back to some of the classics. You can even go back, like when I was really starting to work and develop. I don't do it as much now, but when I was really starting to work with a lot of things, I would go back and look at 12th and 13th century English literature. which is, it's a different, it's a very different language than we speak now. And I'm sure it's quite the same in Spanish and Portuguese. I mean, there's probably a time when Spanish and Portuguese were more or less a similar dialect that's kind of split later. So what was that? What's the literature from that time? What's the literature from the from like, from all the times? What's the 19th century? What are the classic? What is like the period when everyone says this is the greatest era of Portuguese literature? This is the greatest era of Spanish literature. What is that era? It's a classic, and you may say, "Oh gosh, it's just we had to read it in school." Well, you got to go back and you got to look and see, why is it that people found something of value there? I went back and I read John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, this is a total Christian thing, and the thought was like, didn't care for that, but the way he used the language was really instructive. Now, of course, he was writing in, was it the 16th century, 17th century, 17th century, I think. But a real master of English verse. So he's really recognized. He and Shakespeare are considered among the real masters of classical English poetic forms. So you read it, and you've got to figure out. So in Spanish, again, I know nothing about Spanish or Portuguese literature except for like one or two names like Cervantes. And I don't even really know from Portuguese, I'm sorry. Like Cervantes in Spanish or whatever. You read, who are the classics? And you look at them and you see, what are they? How do they work? How do they put together? How do their verses work? So you've got to do a little bit of literary study in your own language. Oh, I forgot to mention you have to know the grammar. You have to know current grammar and editing standards. That should go without saying. That's why I didn't say anything about it. If you don't know how to write good Spanish and good Portuguese, if you don't know when you can break the rules and when you can't, then forget it. So, but you have to learn the literature in your own language. You need to look at the classics. And the reason why I think it's important to look for the classics is because they were actually very careful about their literary technique. And of course, writers these days are also careful about literary technique, but they had a very strong formal structure, and particularly when you're looking at verse. And if you understand how that verse works, that classical verse works in Spanish and Portuguese, then when you come to translating something that was written in Tibetan classical verse, or even in Sanskrit classical verse, then you can figure out a way to get that feeling of this being classical in your own language. Not that you're going to go back and write in 17th century Spanish or Portuguese. I'm not going to recommend that. But you need to know the techniques that they use. How many syllables per line? What did they do about rhyme? What did they do about this or that? So you can have like a palette that you can use. You look at the wordplay. Now, of course, some areas of wordplay are like everyone kind of, I mean, I don't know about everyone, but we kind of pick them up. Like like you have rhyme, the ends, the lines having the same sound. This is probably easier in Spanish and Portuguese than in English because of the way your languages work. You have alliteration where you have words starting with the same consonant sounds. You have assonance where you have the same vowel sounds. How do you use them? How do you put words together? How do things play in the work? So that you can figure out, how do I kind of bring the feeling of this Tibetan into my own language? In order to do this, you have to have technique. And the only way to get technique is to write verse. And you're going to write terrible verse at first in your own language. It doesn't matter that it's terrible. You're learning how to do it. So you need to take whatever the classic version is. Like in French, it's the Alexandrine, and I believe that also is used in Spanish, maybe in Portuguese too. Whatever it is, the classical form, learn how to write in this classical form. Practice. One good way to do this is to take, like we have piles of praises of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, 4 lines. 고독하라 조산 얘기 우라젠. 두지쟁기 졸라서 채널지라 차살로. 4 lines in Tibetan. How can you bring this into your own language so you've got this feeling and rhythm? What are the different forms that you could use? Are you going to try doing rhyme? Are you going to not? How are you going to do it? So you just try to play with it. So you can do this like, if you have a particular Buddha, Bodhisattva, Yidam deity who you feel a real affinity and devotion for, you can take their praise in Tibetan and translate it into your own language. It's like an exercise, both in literary work and in gaining feeling. If it's a Bodhisattva for whom you have like some sort of, like if you really, Tara, if Tara is really it for you, then she's the one. And you translate a bunch of praises of Tara into your own language and kind of get. The 21 homages are a different question. That's a very different question. I wouldn't start with those. Those are difficult. Don't start with the hard ones, start with the easy ones. Do the one line, do the one verses, those are going to be easier. But don't torture yourself with the 21 homages yet. Later, yes, not yet. At some point, I want to talk a little bit about the 21 homages to Tara, but I don't want to get into that right now because we're talking about the idea of what you have to learn how to do and some ideas about how you do it. You can also work on just writing things in verse in your own language occasionally. Like if you like writing it's your guru's birthday, so you write a verse and honor them in your own language. You can do a couple of verses. You can do one in a more classical style, one in a modern style. And this is another way to do it. For example, we have the Dalai Lama's birthday coming up on July 6th. Isn't it 6th? Is that right? Am I totally off? It's coming up. So, well, can you just write a praise of the Dalai Lama in your language? How does that feel? What is it like? So to write something, then translating is a little bit different because you don't have to worry so much about content, but getting a feel for how words work on the lines. And also paying attention to kind of the music. And I think one of the nice things I've heard Spanish and spoken a fair amount, and a little bit lesser extent with Portuguese. There's a lot of rhythm. There's a kind of a flow to it. So how do you get that flow, making it work on a line? How do you do that? So that's in particular with verse. And you can also do little exercises, writing decent, clear prose in your own language. I think I mentioned this last week. There are these books where the introductions are really beautifully written, and then the translations are unreadable. It's not the way it should be. If the introduction is beautifully written, that means you know how to write. So why is your translation so difficult to read? It should be easy. It should be as well written in Portuguese and Spanish as it is as you would normally write for yourself. So working on writing, learning how to write, learning how to condense things. And especially in English, we like things to be very concise. We prefer a concise style. And often we do things grammatically to make writing more compact. So is that how it is in Spanish and Portuguese? Or do you prefer longer? Do you prefer verbosity? I don't know. In English, it wouldn't sound good, but in Sanskrit, they often like to be very verbose. In English, we like to be concise. What is the feeling in your language? How do you get that feeling? So, and there are also going to be style guides. In English, we have style guides. I could recommend English style guides. I'm sorry, I can't do that in Spanish and Portuguese, but you should look at them. There are probably books on how do you write verse? How do you write poetry? There's probably some well-known contemporary poet whose work you may have read and may be familiar with. And they may have written a book, How to Write Poetry. In English, we have one by a couple of recent guides by Mary Oliver, who was a 20th century, early 21st century poet. She passed away a couple of years ago. She's beautiful poetry, beautiful use of language, but her poetry guides are really, really good. So get something like that, pick it up. I'm not saying that you have to go through like a university course on creative writing and all that. I'm saying you just need to take interest in study and read and get familiar with it. So that's kind of getting familiar with the languages. You're getting familiar with the Tibetan, getting familiar with your own language as the target language. And then there's the question of, well, you have to know what you are translating, which means you have to know the Dharma. Of course, we're all learning the Dharma, and the more you translate, the more you realize you don't really know, and how much you have to learn. There's a lot to learn, and if you're, especially if you're not in like a Shedra environment where you're really studying it all the time, it's difficult. I mean, there are a couple of programs. I mean, there's the what's the one? The begins with an M. The Zonzar Khenpo Rinpoche got started. It was held in Brazil once and then all over the world. What's the name of this program? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Melinda,
yes, the Melinda program. Okay. See, this is, I literally pay no attention to what I don't need to know. And so I forget the things that I don't use on a daily basis. Anyways, the programs like that are helpful because you've got some intensive study. And so whatever program, whatever lineage or teacher, wherever your faith is, wherever your connection is, you should study as much as you can. And especially as much as you can. The more you can study in Tibetan, the better, because you need to learn how it works in Tibetan. And then there'll come a time when there might come a time when you've done a good bit of study and you've studied these texts and you think, I know them. And then that's the place where you're really dangerous, a really dangerous point. When you first finished your studies, and I learned all this, I've studied this, I know this text. Yeah, I know it. But you know nothing. You need to remember, you need to actually always kind of try to be very humble. And it's better to underestimate the amount you know than to overestimate. So always think that basically when you go through your studies, you're going to get to the point we have the three types of prajna. We've got the study of the prajna of listening, contemplation, and meditation. When you go through Shedra studies, you can go through and spend 12 years in a Shedra, but you're unlikely to have done any more than just develop the prajna of listening, not even the prajna of contemplation. And forget about meditating, because the contemplation takes a lot of time, and that's where you need to work, especially as a translator, in developing that. So, at the end of I spent only 4 years in Shedra, and I thought, oh, well, I knew all these texts and blah blah blah. But the more I worked with them, the more I realized I didn't know. And I go back and I look at the same texts. I go back when I was teaching the Abhidharma in the last few years, going back and looking and realizing how much I didn't understand or didn't know when I was working on the text pretty intensely. So you have to recognize that it takes a long time to learn. So, I mean, this is, unfortunately, it's not like some sort of a quick process where you're going to be a perfect translator in 5 years, unless you're like an exceptional individual. Most of us, it's going to take 10, 15 years before you're doing anything that's worth anything. Sorry. That's the way it was. That's the way it was for me, basically. So you have to study the texts, you have to know them, and then you have to think about them and use them. And also you get teachings. You might be put to work as an oral interpreter, and that is a really very good opportunity, because when you're preparing for a teaching, often you have to prepare the text. Like I had this for Trungpa Rinpoche. Someone asked me to teach Maitreya's, Uttanamche, the differentiating the middle from extremes. Well, I had to study it. He's teaching the ornament of the middle way. Well, I studied it in Shedra, but I had to read it again. So, you have to do this. You often have to, we're translating this obscure text and you need to translate it before the teaching. So you have to learn that. So that's a way to do that. Now, those translations you do like that are often going to be like, really, they're going to be like first drafts. They're good for a teaching, but you're not necessarily going to have something publishable or a definitive translation then. So you have to have your kind of expectations your expectations low, but your aim high. You want to do as good a job as you can, but you have to recognize where you are and that it takes a long time to develop it. So that's basically this. So there's a lot of study to do. Basically, there are these three areas that you need to study. You've got to study the Tibetan, your own language, and the Dharma. And then you've got to put it together. And then you also have to the more you can really take the Dharma to heart and make sure that do your best to be a good practitioner and a good student to really, because the more you can take it actually to heart, then the more likely you're going to be able to actually communicate something to someone else, because it's not going to be just a head thing. It's going to be something. When the teacher is speaking about impermanence and the importance of practicing, like Drupal Khenpo Rinpoche at Sekai Retreat Center, he's hasn't been traveling and teaching for a couple of years, needless to say. But when he does, he's always talking about impermanence and the importance of giving up on this life and things like that. So if you have thought about and you think about and you understand that, then when you're translating for someone like Drupal Rinpoche, then it makes sense. If you're whoever your teacher is, when you can really take their teachings and internalize them so that then you can bring back some sort of experiential thing. So like the Karmapa said, the Karmapa said to me that you have to be able to translate so people can hear the love in your voice. And by extension, when they have to feel the love in your words when you're doing a written translation. So in order to do this, you have to experience the master's love, experience the love of the authors, and then be able to bring it out to the other. So that just takes time. And it takes remembering the good motivation, starting with remembering that we don't have time. We're talking about a process that could take many years, and none of us can be certain that we're going to get to the end of that process. I mean, we have 2 people out with COVID today. There are probably a lot of other people out with COVID. There are probably people who are passing away with COVID. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, no idea. I was having a nice class in Namo Buddha thinking, oh, what will I do next year? So you have to take the Dharma to heart if you're going to translate the Dharma in a way that will really move people. So that's maybe one more thing to say, and this is, I'm sorry to add more to what you feel like you're doing, what you need to do and what you need to learn. But if you are going to be translating works that were originally written in Sanskrit or perhaps in another Indic language, it's unclear what some of the sutras and things, many of them were written in Sanskrit, many were written in other languages that were translated into Sanskrit. In any case, they were brought into Tibetan largely through Sanskrit. And if you want to actually translate those into your own language, then you actually, even if you're going to work primarily from the Tibetan, you also need to know, at least to some degree, Sanskrit. Because if you don't, you won't see how all our languages are different. Sanskrit is very precise in many ways that Tibetan is not. And in particular, Sanskrit has a very rich vocabulary, and Tibetan does not. So there is, they say, oh, we translated everything faithfully into Sanskrit, but by translating every prefix into Sanskrit, well, you translated the prefix, but you didn't have enough choice of words. So it's actually not as precise as you think. Like one simple, I've been working on Sema, so I have to use an example from Sema. There's the word ngepa. So if you look at it in Tibetan, it's just like one word and you think it's all the same thing. So you go into translating into your own language and you use the same word, maybe varying a little bit for context. Then you go back and you look at the Sanskrit and you find that actually there were at least 4 different words used in the Sanskrit, all of which would be translated differently into English and probably into Sanskrit, or into Spanish and Portuguese. So if you only look at the Tibetan, you're not going to get that difference. Every language, it's like you have this, the semantic maps are different. So you have to find, it's like, this is where it gets dangerous, especially for like someone like well, you probably find this in Spanish and Portuguese, where you have false cognates, a word that means one thing in one language and another completely different thing in the other. And so, the Spanish speaker who's learned a bit of Portuguese says something and everyone bursts out laughing, or vice versa. Because you said something completely ridiculous, not knowing it, because you assumed it was the same. Or, you assume that it has the same range, but it doesn't. So that's the process with any language. So in order to get an accurate idea of if you're translating something that was originally written in Sanskrit, then it's important to learn a bit of Sanskrit. But I'm not going to say too much about that right now, other than just kind of stress the importance of that. Okay, well, now I've given you lots to do, but you might have some questions about it. Is that someone there? Anyone have a Gustavo? Okay, I see a hand raised. Okay, go ahead, Gustavo.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk. I would like to ask about, when you say about studying the Dharma, like the technical knowledge of the Dharma in order for us to be able to translate. Many times, like here in Chakdugompa, it's mainly Vajrayana stuff, but most of us do not even study all the Mahayana Shastras and stuff. So no need to speak about reading tantras and commentaries about them. So what do you feel about understanding the tantra world and the tantra literature in order to be able to translate like sadhanas and stuff that is particularly Vajrayana?
Okay, this is a very good question, and I'm personally less schooled. I have less experience with the tantra. I've always spent more on the sutra tradition, but that's okay. I mean, my feeling though, when you're talking about a tantric translation, is it's similar, although the meaning needs to be different. And there's also a difference between the Nyingma and the Sarma. Like with the Nyingma, there's not as much available in Sanskrit. With the Nyingma tantras, it's not that there's no basis. Actually, they had a whole library in Samye with all the Nyingma tantras, but we don't have that access. So that's one different thing. I think that in order to understand the Tantra, you have to have a basic understanding of some of the main things. Bodhicitta is critical. It's going to be explained in different words in Tantra. You have to have understanding of impermanence. I mean, those are just critical. But you can study, if what you're primarily working with, if your primary focus is Tantra, then you learn the language that you need to know for Tantra. So I've worked primarily with sutra materials and philosophy, so that's a different area. So your area of expertise or area where you need to work is on that tantric literature. And when you're looking at that, of course, you have to be aware of the things, the symbolism that comes out. I mean, often, especially in the Sarma, we talk about the attributes of the deities as representing qualities that are discussed in the Abhidharma. So you have to have some understanding of that to know what they're talking about, so that you can know what words to use for it, right? I mean, when they're talking about, I don't know how detailed the commentaries are. They talk about, a necklace with 51 skulls is representing 51 mental factors. Well, what are the mental factors? Where are you going to learn that? They're probably described to some extent in the Tantra literature, but they might also assume that you know them from the Abhidharma. But on the Tantra, another level that is really most important is, well, there are two things that are important. The first is that because Tantra is so dependent upon the guru, you have to just do what your guru tells you and have complete faith in what the guru tells you. So when your guru says, you don't need to study this, you don't need to study it. Whatever you do need to study this, you do need to study it. The second thing is that when you're practicing and translating a sadhana, then there are two aspects of that. First is you should do the sadhana, you should do the practice yourself. I don't like to translate practices where I haven't done them to some degree. I mean, maybe not a full, but if you really want to translate it, you have to understand it. And with a practice, that means that you need to have practiced it. So that's really important. Then the other aspect is you have to think about, again, how do the words work in Tibetan to communicate the feeling? How can you make that happen in Portuguese or Spanish, right? You need to understand your own language. That also applies, because you need to know, I mean, especially the tantric texts are often written in very rhythmic on this, and very difficult to translate into English. You should, when you translate them, you do not, I'll speak about this more next week, but you don't need to feel like you need to match everything word for word in there. You need to make it into beautiful poetry in Portuguese so that people look at it and say, oh, this is what it means. And then you have there are lots of different technical issues for doing it, but you have to have some experience and know what's important and how things work in the Tantra so that when you translate it, you're able to bring it in. The word order is different, but the visualization order follows the visualization order in Tibetan. So you have to work with a word order in your own language to make the visualization make sense. So these are all some of the different issues that you come up with. So it really, again, means it's a different genre, but you just have to study it and you have to learn it. And particularly for Vajrayana, you have to practice it as best as you can. Not so easy. Okay, I think the next one to raise his hand was Nuno.
Hello from Chile. Well, thank you for all your previous teaching on this one. Very illustrating and inspiring. And well, my question is, when translating verse, I'm under the impression that in Tibetan they don't use rhyme a lot, if at all. But when we use verse in Spanish, all the different forms of verse, they do use rhyme. And when you read something in verse, you're kind of expecting the rhymes. It's everywhere, even in in folklore, not necessarily classical, very scholastic verses, but even in street level verses, you have rhyme. So when translating verses from Tibetan into Spanish in order to make it beautiful, and in Spanish, is it okay to use rhyme? Should we use rhyme? To what extent? Because I haven't seen it a lot in translations from Tibetan that rhyme is used in Spanish.
Okay, yes. You should feel free to use whatever literary device you want to in order to bring. I mean, you need to look at the Tibetan and see what devices they're using in Tibetan. What are they doing? And so Tibetan does not have rhyme. They don't use rhyme at all. They often will repeat homonyms to make them, words that sound the same, like Yurpa. They'll repeat that, or sometimes they'll repeat words. And so this is what we'd call in English, we'd call it a turn, where you have the same word that's kind of repeated in different areas. So they do use literary devices. So when you are bringing it into your own language, well, actually, the common level, street level language verse is often a very good level of verse to translate into. And so looking at literary verse does not necessarily mean that you're looking at the equivalent of Shakespeare. You're looking at the equivalent of like a Scottish ballad, maybe, or a regular ballad. So if people in Spanish, when they're reading verse, expect rhyme, then Rhyme's fine. There's nothing wrong with rhyme. So one of the problems is there are not so many translators into English, at least, who think that translating into verse is important. They think that it's important to translate the meaning, and they don't worry so much about verse. So I'm a little bit on the minority on that in English translators, though there are a few others. It may be similar in Spanish. Of course, I have no knowledge of it. So it may be similar in translations into Spanish. They look at the translations into English, where they basically take a Tibetan verse and slap it on 4 lines of prose and call it verse, which it's not. So you need to do what you can to make it into Spanish or Portuguese verse, so that people will look at it and have like that reaction. The main thing in Tibetan, what's important in verse is this pattern of stresses in a line, right? You've got the 7-syllable line, the 9-syllable line, and you've got this pattern of stresses. You've got 2 + 2 + 2 + 3 for a 9-syllable line, and so forth. In some folk verses, you might have like a 3 + 2 + 2 + 2, the number of syllables. That might not work that probably won't work in Spanish or Portuguese, because your rhythms are different. You can't match the Tibetan rhythms. Tibetan is made up of like pairs of syllables with occasional extra things thrown in. So it's very easy to take the verse and put it into that Tibetan rhythm. But you can't replicate that in English. And I think it would be even harder to replicate it in Spanish and Portuguese. So don't try. Make it into nice verse. The feeling of the verse is not, you can try you can do a little bit. You can try to find out what works, what gets closest in English or in your own language. But you shouldn't figure that it has to be exactly the same. It has to be, in other words, you have to make sure that you're making something that sounds nice in your own language, that people will say, like, oh, this is beautiful. And then when you have verse, the structures of verse make it easier to remember. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to do. So the rhyme is going to make people remember, yeah, it has to go like this, because they know that the rhyme is going to bring them down to it. So it makes it, again, easier to hook and easier to remember in their mind. So in English, we've lost a lot of the rhyme. It used to be very common to rhyme, but rhyme is harder than in English than it is in the Romance languages. So we've kind of lost it in English, but you shouldn't necessarily shy away from it. You've got to do what you can to bring the feeling across. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and I think Lisa, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. You mentioned that it is very important for us to read a lot in Tibetan.
Yeah.
Read Tibetan literature, all kinds of genres as well. I don't know, maybe this is a silly question, but when do you think it's a good moment to start reading that, taking into account the level we've got, so that, our understanding right now is really low?
Yeah.
But did you say that it is important to read, even though maybe we don't understand much, but we get the structure, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very good question. And at the point where you don't understand a lot, you should focus on reading for pronunciation and just I think I spoke about this last week a little bit. You've got to read every day in order to be able to look at the letters and get a sound out of them. And you do this very slowly. So if you're like at the beginning, if you're one of the beginning students at Dharmasagar, or in the beginning, or don't have a lot of experience, then you've got to go slowly, and you're not going to get a lot of meaning out of it at first. It's going to be, in a few months, you'll be able to look at these things and start being able to get a little bit of meaning. In a few months, you'll get to the point where you'll look at these and you'll kind of know what a bunch of the words are and have no idea what it actually means. So you just have to keep reading. So at this point, you need to go back or be really diligent about doing even going back to doing the jorlok, where you're putting everything together. And just reading like that over and over again, so that then you get to the point where you can go Kaju Temba or something like that. You just see the words, and it automatically comes to mind. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be working so hard to put it together put the sounds together in your mind, that you're not going to be able to do it. So the only way to do that is a lot of practice reading. If you think about it, think about how difficult it is for young children to learn the Roman alphabet. How many years do children spend learning the ABCs in English, we call it? I don't know, that you have these big books, and there are years and years where they're going for A is for aardvark, B is for boy, the cat, and they're learning all these things. So you've got to so we have to actually go through all of that work that we did between the times we were probably 3 and 7, 3 and 8, right? 5-6 years worth of work. You're going to try to condense it into like a few months in Tibetan, which means you got to actually just take the time to go and read and just read. So at first you read without worrying about the meaning, just to practice reading. Then eventually, as you get more of a vocabulary, things will start coming to you. And actually, when you read things, even not understanding them, you start to understand more just by virtue of having read more. And it'll start gradually coming together. And you just keep at it. And at some point, you're going to feel like you can read things and you only need to occasionally look up words. That's the point where you can start looking at at the literature and start actually reading for literary reasons.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that is maybe enough for today. Thank you all for joining us. And I haven't said everything. I still have things I can say next week. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. So at this point, let's please do the dedications, and think to yourself that we're dedicating the merit of this so that all sentient beings may come to happiness and freedom from illness and so forth. And in particular, we're in an age where the epidemic keeps coming back, as we've been reminded by Danny and Drupchen not being able to participate today. And so let's please also make the prayer that all epidemics in this universe and any other universe may soon be quelled. All beings may be completely healthy, encounter the Dharma in their own language, gain feeling, and progress to Buddhahood. And so with this dedication, let's please recite the verse Sanamdi. O Sanamdi Tamje Sebani Tomne Beranam Panjede Kegana Chibalong Trobai Sibe Tolero Gunyarasho. By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all wanderers from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khenpo.
Thank you, Khenpo.
Thank you.
See you next day.
Okay. All right, I'm leaving now, so bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.